Hey. Um, Education is a topic that Virgin is passionate about. Throughout the day, we've highlighted some of the ways that Virgin and other partners like Pearson are making education a priority. We're very excited to present a panel of industry leaders from a variety of backgrounds to discuss the pressing issues surrounding the future of education. Does the current model make the grade? We're streaming live from WeWork Moorgate here in the heart of London. WeWork is leading the way in co-working and innovative workspaces around the world. We'd like to extend a big thank you to them for hosting our full day of programming and interactive experiences. We'd also like to extend a huge thank you to Pearson for their incredible support of this Disruptors event. As our presenting sponsor, they've allowed us the opportunity to create something truly special here today, and we're incredibly grateful for their knowledge and expertise. So, does the current model make the grade? Is education living up with the 21st century? To join the debate or to ask the panel a question, please tweet using the hashtag Disruptors. And to help us address this topic, I'd like to invite today's moderator on stage to take it from here. Please welcome the wonderful Clemency Burton-Hill.
Thank you so much, Sam, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here. For those of you who are watching on the live stream and who haven't been lucky enough to be in the room today, we've had an absolutely scintillating day, really extraordinary discussions, talking about education from so many different perspectives, and I'm hoping that that's going to continue now in our final session of the day, this debate, does the current model make the grade? I'm absolutely delighted and honoured to have with me on stage and hopefully joining us on Skype very soon, our very esteemed panel. They come from a variety of backgrounds. They all share one common goal, which is to bring real change to the conventional ways in which we're educating. And they all, in one way or another, are disrupting the future of education on a global scale. So let me introduce them to you now. First up, probably the most famous physicist since Einstein. I'm going to go out there and say that. Professor Brian Cox. He, of course, is so modest. He would hate me for saying that. So.
Stephen Hawking.
Oh, well, I suppose Stephen Hawking. I don't know. I think if you go around the world, though, and ask people, Brian Cox would definitely be a household name. He's our very own rock star scientist. He's a former keyboardist with the pop group Dream. He's also the author of several best-selling books and the host of TV series, radio series that have gone around the world and inspired so many millions of people. Children, but also adults too. And his work at CERN and his efforts to make science, and in particular STEM education, more accessible to everyone, especially girls, and just a few of the reasons why his is a household name. So Brian, thank you so much for being with us today. We're also delighted to have Rod Bristow with us. He is president of core markets at Pearson. He's worked in education, publishing, and educational assessment for over 30 years in a variety of institutions. So really, no one knows more about these subjects than Rod. He oversees more than 100 countries through Pearson's core market. So we're really looking forward to hearing your insights, Rod. And on my right is Toby Young, a controversial broadcaster and journalist. He can always be relied upon to provide refreshingly candid opinions on everything. He's an associate editor of The Spectator, very well known for his book, How to Lose Friends and Alienate People. Within the world of academia, he's the founder of the West London Free School, which is an academy designed to provide children with a classic liberal education. It was the first free school to sign a funding agreement with the then Education Secretary Michael Gove. Now, one non-profit education model that has transcended the country where it was born, the US, and moved onto the global stage is Teach for All. And with us via Skype, I hope we're very happy to have Wendy Kopp, its CEO and co-founder. Wendy, are you there? How do we make this happen?
I am here.
Hi,
Can you hear me?
This is excellent news.
I'm looking at you, and I'm very excited to. I wish I could be there in person, but hopefully, I'm going to appear on your screen shortly.
You are with us, and we're delighted to have you. Teach for All, as I'm sure you're all aware, is a network of independent organisations which expand educational opportunities in those countries by enlisting talented future leaders, and leadership is one of the key questions we're going to be talking about today. So, Wendy, we're delighted to have you with us, and thank you for being with us. Very different from Teach for All, but another educational model that's totally disrupted the status quo is, of course, the Khan Academy. And joining us via Skype too is Shantanu Sinha, its President and Chief Operating Officer. There he is. We can't hear you very well at the moment. Is there anything that can be done about that?
Yes, I hope. I assume the audio guys can look into that. But.
No, we're all good now. Thank you so much for being with us, and we're so looking forward to hearing more about your mission to provide a free world-class education for anyone, anywhere, and some very exciting plans for the future. As Sam Branson mentioned, we also really want to hear from you, you watching at home, but also you in the audience. So if you do have questions, please do submit them using the hashtag Disruptors, and there'll be time for questions at the end of our session, so get your thinking caps on. Right. We'll jump straight in. When we started this morning, Richard Branson said that he left school at 15 for a variety of reasons, very disappointed by the sort of education he was receiving, and that in the 50-plus years since that moment, nothing's really changed. So before we start, I just want to get a quick straw poll, quick take from all of you as to whether you think things have changed, where you think the education system is at the moment. Are you feeling good, positive?
Okay.
Or do you think the system's broken, which is one of the other phrases that's kept cropping up today? We'll start with you, Rod.
I'll go first. I mean, somebody said on the stage earlier that when you know a lot about something, you're often less confident about it than when you know nothing. I've worked in education for 30 years, so I find that quite a hard question to answer. But fundamentally, I feel very, very optimistic about education. I do think education has changed. I do think the expectations around education are much higher than they used to be. I think parents care more than they used to care. Certainly when I was at school, I think parents care enormously. I think the energy that you see in our schools, the diversity, the investment, the focus is very, very encouraging. So I'm very optimistic. I think our expectations are higher than they used to be. Some would say they're not, but actually I think the debate that we have in this country is a force for good in raising expectations, and that's particularly been true in the last few years. If there's one thing where I would agree with Sir Richard is that we need to have a sharper focus on what we expect people to learn in the education system, what they can do with it when they leave, its relevance to what they're going to experience in life. And the one thing we hear from parents is their biggest concern about education isn't about the quality of teaching, isn't about the system, it's will my child's education really help them succeed in life? That's what they really want to know. And I think that's a question that deserves a lot more debate and thought about what is the output, what is the product of education, and I think that needs to be debated much more than it is.
And indeed, how do we define success in life? Is it just about getting a job, or is it something else? Toby, what are your thoughts on education at the moment?
I think things are improving a lot in England. I think since 2010, things have improved. I think the reforms introduced by Tony Blair's government and then followed through by the coalition and by the present government have enabled new actors to enter the education space. And we've seen a lot of academies started by entrepreneurs, people from outside the education sector trying to bring their skills and experience into improving educational outcomes. Not all of those have been successful, but some of them have been very successful, and we're beginning to discover how to replicate the successes and ignore the failures. I think we've seen an empowerment of teachers. We see this in the initiative of Tom Bennett of the TES, and who's now the government's behaviour czar. He organises a series of festivals in which teachers present the very latest evidence about what works best in the classroom, and we're seeing some real impact of these reforms. So 1 million fewer children now are educated in failing schools than they were in 2010. Some really good new schools, like not far from here, the London Academy of Excellence, a free school set up by Eton and Highgate, a consortium of schools, and they got more children. It's in one of the most deprived parts of London, Newham, and they got more children into Oxford and Cambridge last year than Wellington or Marlborough. So that's a really good success, and it'd be great to see other schools trying to duplicate their success.
Okay, so that's the UK perspective. Let's, before we come to Brian, let's go to you, Wendy. In general, are you feeling optimistic about the state of education?
Well, first of all, I'm so encouraged about how much optimism there is from those in the UK. I guess I do see reasons to be optimistic. I mean, I've seen much progress, and I've really seen firsthand what's possible, not only in the US, but now all over the world. And yet, I guess my belief, I mean, to the question of have things changed, I mean, not nearly enough. And I think really for all of our kids, I'm sure the panelists would agree with this, but we are just leaving so much on the table. I mean, when you think about all the time kids spend in school and how much we could be doing to prepare them to lead us to new heights as a society, we're just so far from challenging our kids, from leading them to meet the highest of expectations and the expectations that they absolutely have the potential to meet. And then within that, I would also say that, you know, the place where we also have not made nearly enough progress just relates to the most marginalized kids. It's really, you know, I think, and we at Teach for All think one of our society's most significant issues and certainly greatest injustices, that where kids are born really continues to predict their educational outcomes and, of course, in turn, life outcomes. And we've made not nearly enough progress on that.
Okay, so has potential, must do better. Let's get a comment from you, Shantanu.
Yeah, and I am also incredibly optimistic about the next, 100 years of humanity and what education is going to be. I think the future is actually very bright. It's easy to look at all the problems we see today and feel like the sky is falling. But if you think about it in terms of how humans learn for most of time, there's never been a better time on Earth. And I think a large part of that has to do with technology and society and where we're moving to. I think the internet, the mobile devices, these are transformative forces that have transformed how people learn. I have a young son, and when I was a kid growing up, if I had a question, I would just kind of think about it a bit, and it's unresolved. He has a question, he goes online, pulls out his tablet, searches on Google, and it's resolved within seconds. And I think that access to knowledge is absolutely transformative for society. I think, but that's largely because of the trends of how global society is moving forward. I think to Wendy's point and others here, in terms of the actual traditional educational system, it has moved forward. I mean, there are things that have improved, and there's movements in the United States with the charter schools and other things that are driving a little bit more innovation. But I think that's where you look at the system and you feel that there's a lot more to be done. But I do think broadly, if I look at it from my children's perspective, my grandchildren's perspective, I'm very optimistic about the future.
Brian?
Well, all right, let me inject some negativity then, just for the sake of argument. Only a bit, though. So my contact with students is I lecture first years, so I get them straight out of school. I'm lecturing them this term, actually, at the University of Manchester in physics. And one of the things that I and many of my colleagues feel it necessary to say in the first lecture is to tell the students that now they have to take responsibility for their own understanding. So whilst it's partly my job to try and teach them, in my case, quantum mechanics and relativity, if they don't understand what I'm saying, then the appropriate reaction is to go and read a textbook and then perhaps read another textbook. And ultimately what we're trying to do through that 3 or 4 years at university is to turn them into professional thinkers where they have full responsibility for their own understanding. And I always say to them, professional physicists struggle with certain concepts. So some concepts you'll get immediately. Some you might need to take a month sat there reading book after book after book. And there's I always detect an element of shock, and there's a nervous laugh when I say it's your responsibility. If you don't understand something, ultimately it's your fault, it's not my fault. So there's a transition. And I think that worries me. It would be better if there was an element of that mindset coming out of school. And I wonder whether, and this is a topic for discussion, I wonder whether, because really they measure their own success in the way they've managed to pass exams, their exam grades. I mean, there's a strong selection effect in my class because they have to get A star, A star, A on average to get in to do physics. So we get at the top level. But they've measured their success in terms of exam grades, and that transition to measuring your success, which you have to do as a professional physicist in terms of understanding nature, is one that I think many of them find difficult. So that would be, by way of a challenge. I wonder whether that's a valid criticism of the school system, or whether it's just the way it is.
Just on that point, I think the issue of focus on exam results, of course the exam results are important, assessment's important, it always has been, always will be, but the degree of focus on it can have consequences that perhaps we haven't yet fully understood. And if you're not just measuring students on their success, but you then measure their teachers on their success too, you can create a single focus on the exam. And before you know it, the examination tail is starting to wag the education dog. And I think we are at risk, at very minimum at risk, of that happening. And actually, that's a huge issue. It's not just about how we judge teachers. It's also about the confidence of teachers and how teachers can stand up against the system. And we should be supporting teachers, good teachers, to focus on what's right, not just on what is going to get the best league table result.
Can I just come back on that? The Andreas Schleicher, who is the head of the Programme for International Student Assessment, PISA, said that around the world, the conclusion that he's reached is that the most successful education systems combine local autonomy with rigorous public accountability, and holding schools to account through their examination results and their position in league tables is one way of ensuring public accountability for our public education system. And it can go too far in the opposite direction, but if you look at countries, regions where there is very little public accountability, Wales, for instance, where they haven't had league tables since 2001.
Or Finland?
Well, hang on a second. In Wales, 26% of the population over 16-year-olds, as revealed by the 2011 census, have no qualifications whatsoever. So the lack of public accountability, the resistance to public accountability in Wales has had a disastrous impact on public education. And Wales used to be a shining beacon of the public education system. It isn't anymore, and that's partly because of the lack of public accountability.
Let me just say one thing that worries me is that what you're really doing there partly is using students as measurement probes for the school. And whether that's an appropriate use of the student's time, right, to say you're a measurement probe. I don't think you should test an individual in order to work out whether the school's working, if it has a direct effect on their attitude to education, which it may well do. I don't know if it does, but it may at least do.
Well, it's not just using students as measurement probes, it's ensuring that they learn and achieve a certain standard. A survey in 2009 carried out by the University of Sheffield discovered that a fifth of school leavers in Britain were functionally illiterate and innumerate. And that's partly because there wasn't enough insistence that they actually learn how to read and write at primary school. So you need to introduce these tables, these sorts of accountability measures, which teachers understandably resist, in order to make sure that they are given the skills and the knowledge they need in order, at the very least, to be able to read and write.
I want to invite Wendy to come in on this, because Teach for All and Teach for America have very strong, rigorous systems in place for measuring success. You have third-party assessments, you follow the professional trajectory of your teachers after they leave the program. How do you measure the rate of retention and growth of the students, and where do you stand on testing? Because you have in the past been quite outspoken about the need for tests, but also saying and conceding that they don't go far enough and they don't mean everything.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think, to take the latter piece first, I think the point here is that we're committed to equity. And unfortunately, there are massive segments of kids in countries all over the world who are facing enormous challenges, and maybe the most significant among them, and it's so universal, and I've seen it firsthand now in, dozens and dozens of countries, is that there are just pervasively low expectations for what low-income minority kids can accomplish. And I guess what we've seen is that without some standardized system, it's very possible to just let ourselves off the hook way too easily. We've seen whole communities and whole countries in absolute denial that there are opportunity gaps for their kids. And it's just amazing what happens when you can illustrate through some objective standardized assessment what the gaps really are. That all said, so it's true. I mean, we don't believe in a measureless world, but we do believe in developing better and better measures. And unfortunately, we're currently kind of constrained by a system that is measuring success in a very narrow way, even though we know, if we really want to put the kids in our classrooms, especially the most marginalized kids, on a pathway to meaningfully different outcomes, that means we have to teach far beyond. We have to teach with academic rigor, but we do also have to teach far beyond that, which is what's leading us to have to take it upon ourselves to develop a new initiative, around redefining student success, so that we can both help our partners figure out what to aim at in partnership with many others who've thought deeply about this, and then give them access to the tools to actually measure that. So that's maybe a better statement of what we actually believe. But in the interim, we use the assessments that are in place in the schools and school systems in which our people work around the world.
Shantanu, the Khan Academy has implemented a dashboard which helps to monitor student success in real time. So you're taking this issue of assessment and, as we would expect, running with it in an interesting technological way. It shows teachers which students are lagging behind, which questions might be difficult for individuals or for the entire group, and it's much more targeted in that respect. Can you tell us a bit more about it? Can you elaborate on it a bit more? And do you see it ultimately as perhaps becoming an alternative method to more standardized testing?
Yeah, so the way we think about data and assessments and the dashboards that we've built is there's an incredible amount of information that we can track through the use of our products and the learning experiences that are being done online. So we can see when a student learns something, we can see when they're struggling on something. After they've learned it 3 months later, we can see if they still remember it. And we built all of that into the system so that we can diagnose exactly where the student is. Specifically because one of the problems that we see, particularly in math and STEM education, is that there's a lot of students that are trying to learn some concepts, but what they don't know are prerequisites that might be a year or 2 years before that. So you might have an algebra student that's struggling with fractions, and in the traditional system, you're testing them on how well they're factoring polynomials, but what you really want to see is that they're struggling with fractions, that you need to help them with fractions. And we really built our system around trying to diagnose those Swiss cheese gaps, making that information transparent to the student, first of all, so that they understand their gaps and they can take ownership of their own learning, but then also leveraging that information to optimize what we deliver for the students so that we can recommend the right content, the right areas to practice on, and then creating the dashboards, as you mentioned, so that a parent or a teacher can look at that and understand where is every single student in my class? What are they struggling with? What are they doing great on? And how can I make sure that I'm optimizing the learning experience ideally for all of them? So we believe data can be used in really important ways, and we believe tracking how students are doing can be used to improve the learning process. I think the one massive difference that I see with what a lot of people talk about with testing and standardized testing, and the way we think about it is really the fundamental difference between a lagging metric and a leading metric. So like in the business world, if you have a lagging metric that tells you after the quarter is over that you completely missed your earnings, that's interesting information, and maybe 3 months from now you'll do something about it. And the way we test right now in schools, we essentially do that with a standardized testing, which is when the school year is over, we test the students, and we get the results somewhere in the summer. The students don't really care about it, and we're just using it as an evaluative method, which is completely losing 99% of the value of the data. And what we see is it's much more important to be the leading metric. It's much more important for us real time to understand exactly where is every student, and then empower the student and give that information to the teachers so that they can fix it tomorrow. If they see a student struggling with something today, they can fix it tomorrow. So we really look at the way technology can enhance the use of testing and data as a really important means in which you can make this real time, make it more adaptive, and provide information that can help the learning process for the students much more directly.
You mentioned adaptive, and we'll be talking much more about technologies and adaptive technologies in particular in a moment. But Rod, you mentioned Finland. I think it's a very fascinating model. We can talk about more, but
yeah. Well, I think the issue actually isn't with testing. I don't even think it's with accountability systems, because they're very, very important. I think there is a problem, though, if all you care about in an accountability system where you measure teacher performance are the exam results. You need to care about a lot more than that, and there are a couple of reasons for it. One is that if all you care about is the exam result, you're going to get a kind of a natural behavior towards teaching towards exams and teaching towards tests. And I think the other problem is that exams, any assessment, is by its very nature a snapshot of what somebody knows at a point in time about what you ask them at that time. It doesn't define fully how well educated they are. There's an awful lot more to it than that. And until we have assessment systems that measure everything, and we're working on it, but you know that's something we need to work harder on. Just using exams to measure teacher performance is dangerous, and I think we just need to be very careful about how we use exams. There's nothing wrong with exams; they're important. It's more how we use the data we measure, not the data itself.
Brian, did you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I thought that was a very interesting point at the Khan Academy, that the key reason you would test is to provide immediate feedback about the success of individual students. That's not using the student as a measurement probe, but focusing on the individual student. And as I understand the Finnish model, I read a little bit about it, that's really central to it. The teachers themselves are charged with focusing on each individual student and making sure that student achieves everything they can. And that's the central point of the system, which seems to me to be a very good point.
Partly related to the scale of Finland. Is such a bespoke education scalable for a country like the US or the developing world?
I think the practice that Brian just referred to, frequent testing in order to get a feedback loop going between student and teacher, yes, of course that's scalable.
But why do you need to test in order to get that feedback loop? Well, surely in the course of your natural classroom, it may not be in a classroom as the Khan Academy, but why does it have to be a test? Why can't it just be in the course of the learning?
Well, it's quite hard to find out how much a particular student has learned if you don't actually test them and see, what they can reproduce in that test. It's the short. But one good reason for doing it was alluded to by Wendy. The problem with relying too much on individual teacher assessment as opposed to tests is that teachers aren't as reliable when judging the ability and the aptitude of pupils as tests are, and often an unconscious bias against students from low socioeconomic backgrounds comes into play when teachers are assessing. Not deliberately, it just happens. They have lower, unconsciously sometimes, lower expectations of children from disadvantaged backgrounds, and that can impact on the feedback loop. Whereas if you introduce a test, it is by definition blind and is therefore less likely to be biased.
Let's talk about technology, because it's obviously impossible to have a conversation about the future of education without thinking about it. Chase Jenkins earlier was, in fact, we've heard from everyone. Carl, when he started this day off today, said there's no such thing as a technophobe in the 21st century. We heard from Jonathan from Google, who was saying that actually all classrooms just are digital now. We're seeing an encroachment into the classroom all the time of technology. Where do you stand on this, Rod? Obviously, many of Pearson's products now have a digital element to to them? Is it an inevitability that education just is technological in the future?
Well, you're right, most of what we do now involves some elements of technology. Very little of what we do is purely print or purely analog. But I think the important thing to say about this subject is that what really counts is great teaching. And I think if we lose sight of the teaching and focus too much on the technology, we're going to make some mistakes. And the technology that we develop must primarily be in the service of great teaching, and therefore of great teachers. And the way teaching and technology come together is really where the opportunity lies. And there is a very, very significant opportunity because technology can help all kinds of things. It can certainly help access to education. You can provide courses in sixth form, for example, using technology that you might not be able to provide because you might be able to provide access to great teaching that isn't available just in that individual school. So it helps access, it helps engagement. Technology, for example, in the way we use it for assessing mathematics skills, you learn maths, it's one of those subjects you can learn by doing. So technology is a great way of learning maths because you constantly, time on task, a lot of sort of doing of exercises in a way which give you direct feedback as a learner in an impersonal way, that you're not going to be embarrassed because it's coming to you personally, directly, and it's an engaging way to learn. So the feedback that you get and the feedback that your teachers get, the data if you like, is also incredibly valuable. So there are enormous opportunities for technology. Technology will make a huge difference, but I think we're still very much in the early days.
Toby, the future for you was about looking back in some ways.
Yes, I'm sceptical about the benefits of technology and think it's often overhyped. A good example, Charles Clarke, when he was Education Secretary under Tony Blair, his big crusade was to introduce a whiteboard into every classroom in England. And he more or less achieved that. And all the evidence suggests it had no impact whatsoever on pupil attainment. If you'd spent the money that he spent on all those whiteboards, many of which are now propping up brooms in cupboards, if you spent that money on increasing teacher salaries, there's no question that that would have had more of an impact.
So is the same true of iPads and other tablet devices that go into classrooms now?
I think the big question, which we're going to have to face quite soon, is to what extent can teachers be replaced by intelligent machines? And lots of people are very resistant to that, and I'm instinctively resistant to it myself. I'm sure we all have stories about individual teachers that inspired us, and it's hard to imagine people as children being inspired by intelligent machines, but perhaps that anecdotal evidence is misleading, and actually intelligent machines, if they're well designed, could actually do the job teachers do better. And I think that we'll have to, but what we've done in the group of free schools that I've helped set up with some teachers and parents in West London, we have to a great extent gone backwards rather than forwards. So we've tried to replicate what it is the best independent schools, the best grammar schools have been doing so well for the past 200, 300 years. But we've tried to make that kind of education, a classical liberal education, proper subject knowledge taught in a traditional way, combined with houses, uniform, competitive sport, and so forth. We've tried to make that accessible to children of all backgrounds and of all abilities. We call it a comprehensive grammar. Hogwarts meets Grange Hill. We haven't yet been properly tested. Ofsted's been into a couple of the schools. We got good in one, outstanding in another, so that was encouraging. But the first proper test will be when the secondary school, which was the first school my group set up, when the first cohort of students take their GCSEs, and that's not going to happen until next year.
But is there much technology used in your classrooms?
We let children bring iPhones into the school, but if or mobile phones, but if they're seen using them, they're confiscated.
Right.
So they use iPads in music and sometimes in art, but no, generally we use it less than other schools.
What's wrong with instruments? If you're not going to use the technology in other.
We're a music specialist school, so they play a lot of instruments.
We'll move on. Brian, what are your thoughts on technology?
I mean, I lecture in a very traditional way, actually. It's a whiteboard now. There was an uproar when they removed the blackboards for some reason. They didn't like the chalk in the AV equipment, so they replaced all the blackboards and everybody got very upset. So I lecture in a very traditional way. What we use technology for at Manchester is for supplementary material. And also to allow the students to talk in essentially web-based forums and for problem solving, as you said, doing the practice. Maths is all about practice. So we use that, but the lectures themselves, certainly my lectures, they're extremely traditional in that sense. I write on a board because I think that's a good way to pace things.
And do your students take notes physically, or do
I
they?
make them. Well, some people don't. Some people think that it's good to provide them with printed lecture notes. I don't, actually. I think that from my experience when I was an undergraduate, was writing the thing down that the lecturer wrote on the board was a good way of learning about it and making your own notes. So I believe that. And so that's what I make them do, and we get some complaints, but not many, actually.
Tried and tested.
Well, I don't get many complaints, actually, so that it seems to work.
Look, I think there's no way that technology will replace teachers. I don't think you're going to find automated teaching coming from machines. That's wrong. I mean, somebody once said that teaching isn't rocket science. It's much more complicated than that. Rocket science is about moving sort of atoms and molecules around. Teaching is about moving minds, and the role that a person plays in that process it will always be incredibly important. But that's not to say technology won't have a very powerful role to play. We've just actually with the University of Exeter, we're just entering into a partnership where we're going to create online postgraduate degree programs that will enable us to reach students that otherwise won't be able to be reached and couldn't do these programs. So the accessibility that technology can provide. So it's a false dichotomy to say it's got to be sort of one or the other.
It was interesting to hear Brian talk about his teaching method, which sounded like what would be described as chalk and talk, which is often frowned upon as an outmoded method of teaching. And another name for it is direct instruction. But actually there was the largest ever study done in which different styles of teaching were compared in America, called Project Follow Through, involving hundreds of thousands of students over a long period. And the result was that direct instruction is a more effective teaching method than any other.
I can say very, very, very briefly, you mentioned, I think, the value of teachers, and the idea you could have some kind of intelligent system that took their place means that what you're removing is the eccentricity and knowledge and depth of knowledge of the individual. And I think once you accept as a student that the teacher is not your only source of knowledge, that they're part of the process, part of the inspiration process, as well as the transfer of knowledge process, and there are other places that you have responsibility to go if you don't understand what they're saying, then what you then do is begin to value slight eccentricities or slight wanderings or moving out of the framework of your teacher or lecturer doing that. And I think that's extremely important, and particularly in the university setting. That's why we have researchers lecturing. We have researchers lecturing because they bring an individual perspective to the subject, and surely the best teachers do that. And that's what you need to encourage. But doing that, the students have to take some responsibility if you allow the teacher and the lecturer to wander a bit.
I have to ask Shantanu to come in on this, and of course you, Wendy, as well. I mean, I'm fascinated by the fact that Khan Academy is not only accessed by, I think, something like 234 people in 234 territories, but it's also used in 15,000 classrooms. So that idea of supplementing what a teacher in a classroom is doing. Shantanu, we're so concerned all the time about what technology is doing to young people's brains and their ability to relate in the real world, make eye contact with people, have kind of the social skills to deal with human beings in the real world. To what extent are you concerned there, if at all, about losing that connection, as Brian said, that spark of a human being in the same room as you, who inspires you, who ignites something? We've talked a lot today about what it means to kind of be on fire with something and to be so enthused by your subject that you pass that on to your students. Is that in any way a concern when what separates the student and the teacher is another digital screen, a sort of homogenized existence that so many of us live now endlessly on screens? Oh, you're on mute, apparently. Sorry.
Part of the educational process which is, there's absolutely a role for the teacher. There will always be a role for the teacher. There's absolutely a role for the parent, and there's absolutely a role for the student. And what technology allows you to do is it provides access and empowerment for the student to really take ownership of their learning in a very different way. So I think one of the things that we've actually started a school at Khan Academy, and we worked with a lot of different schools. And the way we see the role of the teacher and the role of technology is probably a little counterintuitive. A lot of people think, oh, you do it all online, or you do it all in the classic lecture homework style. And fundamentally, we think the whole model can be rethought, first principles. And the way that we see the model is really let's figure out how to empower students to have access to everything that they need. And technology is great at doing that. Give them the ownership, be able to personalize what their needs are, and really help them through the process. But then the physical environment is incredibly important. There's nothing more important to the experience for a student growing up, particularly in K through 12 education, because that's all where the mentorship from the teachers, the teamwork, the leadership, the project-based learning, the application, that's where that should all happen. So in our world and in the schools that we work with, what we try to do is we try to make the whole process more productive. So rather than having 50% of the time taken up by just simple lectures in the classroom, where we think a lot of students could probably take a lot of that via video, offline, or in other means. Let's try to leverage as much of that time when we're together in a room together, doing as much human activities as possible, as much Q&A, as much debate, as much projects together, as much teamwork, and build the skills that, frankly, at the end of the day, are the ones that are going to be much more important for you when you go off into life, which is how do you work with other people. So we definitely see technology playing a big role, being a transformative role, but it absolutely does not replace the critical human dimension.
And Wendy, Teach for All is all about the critical humans. It's all about those leaders. Tell us more about how technology is having an impact on what you guys do.
Well, I just completely agree with really the panel in terms of the view that this is a both and, just speaking from our experience working with the most marginalized kids, we need incredible levels of people power, really working at every level of the system and outside the system as well. And at the same time, it's painful the degree to which we are not maximizing technology as a tool for those people to get where they're trying to go. One thing that's coming to mind is an example of a gentleman named Justin Mathis, who is a particle physicist, actually, which I think is your background, Brian, who joined Teach for Australia and started teaching and just realized his kids were just all over the place in terms of their skill level. And he said no matter what he did to try to, manually differentiate his instruction, there was only so much he could do. And so he paired up with another Teach for Australia alum named Richard Wilson, and they started something called Maths Pathways, which is now working with 15,000 kids in Australia. They're at the very early days, like year 2, and hoping to scale. But in their classrooms, they have increased math performance by 200%. They are brand new, and still that's their outcome, just through using the power of technology, not taking away the teacher, who is so crucial to getting the kids on a mission, building the culture, coaching the kids, and taking on a variety of other issues, but just giving them a tool that enables them to, as you just heard, give ownership to the kids and let them drive their own and move at their own pace and really meet their needs specifically. So I guess our view is we need a lot more innovation. We just need a lot more energy going at this in so many ways. And I do think it starts with people. There's just no question in my mind. This starts with both channeling as many of our society's most creative, most capable, most committed, most entrepreneurial people against the challenge of expanding educational opportunity. And then it requires those people figuring out, how do I use all the resources available to me, technology, hugely, in order to meet the needs of my kids and move them ahead.
Can you say it? You can tell I'm not But there's two things that people are, there's giving ownership, and I say take responsibility. It's the same thing, isn't it? But mine's a bit more aggressive, probably, modern tastes. But I think it's the same thing.
I want to talk about social mobility. It's a very vexed question, obviously, in this country, but everywhere. And you know, Toby, we can talk more about the class system in the UK and the idea that, you know, the brightest and best are still often held back because of their backgrounds. And also, Brian, I would like to talk about gender mobility too. I mean, we've mentioned STEM, we've mentioned girls, and the fact that they're so often the narrative that we hear is they don't go into these subjects. So, because we're running out of time, let's start, if we can, love everyone to come in on the social mobility question. Are you optimistic about how the democratization and the opening up of educational models that we've been talking about today can actually help with that flow of social mobility?
Well, one policy has been much more successful than anyone anticipated in terms of promoting social mobility, and that, curiously and counterintuitively, has been the rising of university tuition fees. Everyone imagined, and one of the reasons for all those student protests back in 2010, that if you increase student tuition fees, fewer students from disadvantaged backgrounds would go to university. But actually, by making it conditional on universities, that if they wanted to charge the full amount, they had to engage in various outreach programs and make their courses as accessible as possible to children from disadvantaged backgrounds. We had last year 20% of children applying to English universities from disadvantaged backgrounds. And you contrast that with Scotland, where university is still free if you're a resident of Scotland. Far fewer disadvantaged students end up in the Scottish university system. But having said that, I think there are some policies which can be really effective. Having said that, I think it's tough on schools to expect them to do more about increasing social mobility. Of course, there are things they can do, and everything Wendy said earlier about having high expectations of all students, using tests as a form of assessment to try and eliminate bias, trying to teach all children the same rigorous academic curriculum that has only traditionally been taught to those at the top of our society. You can do all these things to try and make an impact on social mobility. But there was a book published recently by an economist called Gregory Clark called The Sun Also Rises, in which he looked at rates of social mobility, not just in different contemporary parts of the world, but also back in time as well. And he discovered that with a few exceptions, it was almost constant and it was usually very low. So it may be that expecting schools to do more to address something which looks as though it's never really happened. Even if you look at pre-industrial societies compared to post-industrial societies, it doesn't matter whether it's Sweden or Brazil, the rate is typically very low. So it may be expecting schools to do too much to expect them to have an impact on that.
There are some schools that do succeed in solving this issue of the attainment gap, and given that some do, there must be some lessons to be learned from that. And I agree it's a huge challenge, and I also agree that it's one that we're not making anywhere near enough progress in. But we ought to be learning the lessons from those schools that are, great schools like the City Academy in Hackney. So some schools are doing it.
Brian, you work with a school in Tower Hamlets that's had some extraordinary results.
It has St Paul's Way, yeah, which was a failing school by all measure 6 or 7 years ago. No sixth form. Now it's got a sixth form. It had half of the... I think everyone who went through the sixth form went into higher education of one form or another. Half of them went into Russell Group universities to do STEM subjects, and half of those were girls. And 100% of them, it happens, were ethnic minority just because of where the school is in Tower Hamlets. So it's a tremendous success story. It was achieved, by the way, partly by partnering with the universities, in particular Queen Mary, were very active in encouraging the students there to do research, in that case into diabetes. And one of the reasons that was chosen was because it's an issue in that area for socioeconomic reasons and other reasons, actually. So it's an issue that has a scientific component to it, which touches the local community, interests the students, and that's been a tremendous success story. And I should say, with most universities now, I don't know whether it's interesting to make that link, actually. It may be true that there's tuition fees have forced universities into being more active. In any case, so at Manchester, which is an example I could give, we have something called the Manchester Access Programme, which is quite a blunt selector. I think it's your parents can't have gone to university, you should be eligible for free school meals, I think that's it. It's a very blunt selector. And then you have to come on a course at the university. And if you do all that, we drop the A-level grade requirement. So it roughly corresponds to, if it was a 3 A's, then it would be A, B, B. We provide help with filling in the UCAS forms. We provide scholarships as well, which is partly charitably based, so depending on how much money we've got for the lowest income students. And that works extremely well. And we find that those students do very, very well, actually, because it's much harder to get ABB from a school that's not particularly successful than it is to get A star A from an extremely successful school. So the university now, I suspect if you took away that stick now, then if indeed it was the stick that started universities doing that, then they'd still do it, because we find the students are actually students that we want.
Shantanu, in some ways, Khan Academy is kind of the definition of how education coupled with vision and the right technology can improve the flow of social mobility. Previously, when someone has talked about solutions for the underserved, we think about cheap approximations to what the rich had, but what you guys are saying now is actually any child in the world has access to the finest. You know, these are what Bill Gates's children can be learning from as well. So how do you feel about social mobility and the part that Khan Academy is playing in it on a global scale?
I think technology is transformative in this dimension because of the accessibility. And I think the accessibility goes in many ways. We're used literally by Bill Gates' children and by other children of various means. And we're also used in orphanages in Mongolia and in the developing world. And that's transformative, that you can kind of create the best content globally and make it accessible to anybody, anywhere around the world, and I think technology, and I think we're still in the beginning. That we're working on going into India in a big way over the next few years, and getting this down to really cheap mobile devices and really low cost mechanisms, where at least, you know, the vision that I imagine in 5-10 years, you would expect as many students on the planet as possible, and the vast majority of the planet, to have access to the cumulative sum of the world's education in a way that they can really consume, and that's pretty transformative in making it accessible to people. I think there is still a big challenge beyond that, because that only gets you so far, and I really do think to fully reach and change the world and society, there needs to be a lot more on-the-ground support for the communities. Things like Teach for All, things like nonprofits working in the developing world and low-income places around the world that are providing the not just the access to the information, but the mentorship to the students, the right opportunities to get to make, you know, to get a better life for them. So I definitely think it's not a solve, but I am optimistic that the role technology can play is pretty transformative in this dimension.
Wendy, last word on social mobility to you, and then we'll open it up.
I could not agree more with what was just said. I mean, I think, first of all, that these technology tools provide incredible kind of equity of access. I will say, I mean, we've seen all over the world that the most disadvantaged kids, I mean, I can't tell you how many whole schools, classrooms, et cetera, I've seen that are actually putting disadvantaged kids on a path to extraordinary, you know, success on an absolute scale. But wherever I've seen it, we're going so far beyond equal access. We're providing kids a whole lot more time, higher expectations, in all honesty. We're shooting for much bigger things in terms of their own leadership development, because of what we know they will have to overcome in order to attain the same opportunities as kids in more privileged communities. And it's all very logical when you step back and think about it. It's like you've got whole segments of kids facing so many extra challenges that the most privileged kids don't face. There is no way that equal access will produce equal outcomes. No way. Absolutely no way. So we're going to have to provide these kids a whole lot more. And we should, because if we can help them fulfill their potential, we will be much closer to meeting all of the rest of our global aspirations. So it is possible if we're willing to step up and approach it in that way.
Beautifully put. Right, we're going to throw it open to you lot. I think there are some roving mics. We'll start over here with this gentleman. Is there another mic running around so that we can speed things up? No, maybe just the one.
Hi, thanks. You spoke a lot about assessments earlier, and I thought the real-time feedback was quite interesting, but we haven't really talked about creativity and soft skills and how they can be measured, tested and improved in the future of education.
I'm going to start with you, Brian, because I know that when you were 12, you had a physics teacher called Mr. Galloway who helped you with an electronics project that basically meant that you could connect your drum to your synthesizer. And that was a way of actually using music, using physics to help you with your music project. And that massively helped.
Yeah.
Set you on your path.
That was when he had complete freedom, I think, and I think we had a whole lesson on it because it was free a days in the early 80s, wasn't it? It's a good question, isn't it? I don't know how you'd measure it is the answer. I mean, the only thing I would say, and I'll perhaps let someone else contribute, you might have a view on how you would measure that, is that I see education as I don't see it as the acquisition of knowledge, actually. I see it as what we're trying to do, certainly at degree level in physics, is provide people with the tools to be professional acquirers of knowledge. And it goes to one of the questions, actually, it was on the sheet that you handed out before the thing, which probably you may ask at the end, but it's how do you prepare people for the future? Then it's surely to not really make them think that they're somehow, they're paying tuition fees, let's say, that they're buying in a set of knowledge, a box of knowledge which is mapped out in a syllabus, and they'll be tested on it to see if they got value for money at the end. It seems to me that what we're really trying to do is produce professional knowledge acquirers and explorers, and in terms of scientists, explorers of the unknown, and that's very important, actually. I don't know how you test that other than one way you can do it at university, actually, is to get them to do research projects, because then you really see whether they understand how to do that. If you can actually you can find answers to questions that don't have answers, and that you actually do research. That's one way of doing it.
Did you want to come back on that, Rod?
I think I think it's a great question. It's the question that's being answered in countries all around the world. The issue of soft skills, some would say you can't measure them. It is true that there are not ways that have been really worked through to be tested. But I would say that if you can't measure them, how come is it that employers and universities, when students arrive, are themselves making assessments of what are these skills that students really have? And so I actually think that we need to think more deeply about the ways in which you can assess these kinds of skills. And it's one of the things we are working on. However, I do not believe that assessment will ever be able to assess everything. So there were some things we can't assess, and it comes back to the teaching. So to build into the way the teaching happens, the learning happens, to encourage the development of these sorts of skills in the teaching and learning, the taking of responsibility, the collaboration with others, the leadership, all of those things. It comes back partly to the teaching, but there is an assessment dimension we need to work harder on.
And once again, we look to Finland, because not only the world beating in maths and science, but also in classical music, which is a very disruptive model. We'll go to you first, and then to you. Thank you.
My question is, we're becoming more and more connected, Snapchat, Viber, Skype, Facebook, and all this. But for me, maybe the problem with education is that we are getting disconnected from what the real definition of education should be. What is wrong with just, kind of learning something for the hell of it? Because that's the fun, that's the curious thing, that's what we do when we are 6-year-olds. I see kind of education after kind of like all the debates, a bit like a gym membership. Just because you pay your gym membership and your direct debit does not mean you're going to get fit. So,
alas.
And I think that's a bit what we should be teaching our students, as the panel have said, that people should kind of like do it because they want to, and we should kind of create people who are passionate about learning and those kind of like skills that kind of like makes them better human beings, that the little pebble is just as exciting as something that flies in the sky. And I think that it has to start quite early on. So I think that the global definition of education should be reevaluated. And I don't know what the panel thinks about this.
I'm going to take that as a statement rather than as a question, and thank you so much.
I agree with it.
Do we all agree? I think there's nothing to be said, but I'm sure everyone agrees. Let's go to you, Sir.
I think it's probably optimistic to think that everyone around the world could agree on what the purpose of education is. We probably wouldn't have been able to agree in this room. And I think I get slightly irritated when people hold out Finland as this great model that the rest of the world should try and emulate. I'm not sure that is a scalable model. Finland is a very different country to ours. It has something like 10% of the population. 95% of Finns have exactly the same religion. There's very little ethnic or racial diversity. There isn't nearly as much social and economic inequality. So I'm not sure how useful studying Finland is for a country like us, which is so very different.
Fair enough.
Rarely in today's discussions there was a question raised about teachers' education, because essentially, in a way, how the teachers are trained, they are going to replicate that in classrooms. So I am especially interested in the views of Wendy and Chantal. If you had the power to take a blank piece of paper and to redesign teacher education anew, where would you put the acupuncture points? What would you do if you had the power to completely redesign it so that it would fit the needs of the classrooms that you face everywhere in the world?
Great question.
Really good question. I think if I could truly wave a magic wand, I would redesign schools and the school system, and would embed within those schools and school systems a system for recruiting and developing talent that is kind of really integrated into everyday life in schools and systems. That's honestly the biggest thing, I guess, that I've come to think. Like, you think about what resources other organizations, corporations, and such invest in people development. You'd have to invest even more than they do to get to the first-class systems that we're talking about. And I actually think when you start looking at what the highest performing systems in the world do, you look at what they're doing in Shanghai or what they're doing in Finland. I mean, they've really built a system that's deeply connected to the actual environments in which people will teach. And that's really been our biggest learning. I've become... It would take too long, but actually the research would bear this out. I mean, actually the research on teacher education shows that we don't actually know what works. I think we're having a somewhat irresponsible, discussion about teacher development, and that we're assuming that we know what works, we just need to scale it. It's really not true. I mean, we really are on a massive collective learning journey about how to do it. And I think we just need to bring that very close into the schools where teachers need to be accountable for moving their kids forward.
I'm afraid our time is up. Thank you so much to all of our panelists and to all of you. I'm sorry there wasn't more time for questions, but the ones who are physically in the room anyway, you may be able to catch them on the way out. Thank you so much to Wendy Kopp, to Shantanu Sinha, to Rod Bristow, Toby Young, and Professor Brian Cox. Wonderful.